language, but also to produce it. And we see him exercising both of those abilities there in the opening chapters of Genesis. And so we know that God not only built into Adam the ability, but Adam also used it. God also built into Adam all of the things that he needed in order to exercise that ability, including the words and the parts of words that were part of that language, which we'll see later the identity of that language here. And we also know that this language was represented by an alphabetic writing system. So when Adam and Eve began to have children, it is natural for children to acquire the language that they hear their parents or their caretakers using. So therefore, their children went ahead and acquired the language that God had originally built into Adam. And that process continued all the way down to Noah. So the language that Noah and his three sons used was the same as the language that God had originally built into Adam. Now, after the flood, well, the flood had no effect on the language that Noah and his three sons used. So therefore, the language that was used post-flood was the same as the language that was used pre-flood. And so once again, when Shem, Ham, and Japheth began to have children, guess what language those children learned? They learned the language of their parents, which was the language of Noah, which was ultimately the language of Adam. And that process of language transmission continued all the way down to the time of Babel. So the one language that was in use prior to Babel was the language of Adam. Now, at Babel, God mixed the languages. So he took all of the components of Adam's language, the consonants and vowels, the morphemes, the words, and the grammar, the syntax, the way in which the words were put together. And he changed the relationship that existed among all of those elements. And as a result, multiple different languages came into existence. For example, some of the languages, Ugaritic, Canaanite, Akkadian, as well as the Japhetic, represented by Linear A and Linear B, which appear to have been an early form of Greek, which we would call Yawanite, because Javan or Yawan was the father of the Greeks. And then as well as Egyptian, Sumerian, Chinese, and then those languages were gone ahead and changed. That is, as those people came into contact with the individuals who retained the language of Adam, because not everyone's language changed. We know this because of the fact that Noah lived through the time of the rebellion at Babel. And Noah was, as we saw earlier this evening, he was singularly righteous. A man who was singularly righteous would not have participated in the rebellion at Babel, because he would have seen it for what it was, a violation of God's design. So therefore he would have refrained from participating. And surely there were others who also would have recognized the rebellion as a violation of God's design and would not have participated. Now, given the fact that God is just and he does not condemn the righteous with the wicked, those individuals who did not participate in that rebellion, they would not have received a mixed language. They would have continued to use the very same language that God had given to Adam. And we are able to identify the people group that retained that language because of the fact that that people group not only would have retained that language, but they also would have retained an accurate understanding of who God is. And historically speaking, the people group who has retained an accurate understanding of who God is have been the Hebrews, descendants of our fact set. So therefore, you can see that the language of Adam would have passed all the way down through the line of Shem, through the line of our fact set to Eber, which is, and it's from his name that we get the word Hebrew, all the way down to Abraham, and then all the way down to Isaac, Jacob, Moses, all the way down. Now, it's also interesting that if you take a look at the dialects spoken by Lot's descendants, Ammon and Moab, so the Ammonites and the Moabites, linguists will tell you that those dialects are essentially the same as Hebrew, which makes perfect sense because Lot was Abraham's nephew. So guess what? Very same language. And then also Ishmaelite. Well, from Ishmaelite, we have the Arabic tongue, the Northern Arabic, very closely related to Hebrew as well. And then there's also the Aramaic. You know, it's kind of interesting. Jacob, when he went to go find a wife, he went back to the land of Haran, which is in the land of Aram, where they would have spoken Aramaic. Interestingly, Rachel and Leah and Laban, they had no trouble understanding Jacob, did they? Indicates that they spoke a very similar language. And you can take a look at the forms and see that's exactly what happened. Now, coming back on down here, the Canaanites, so the people living there in the land of Canaan, Sidon, Tyre, Phoenicians. We know that originally the people there in the land of Canaan did not use the alphabet. We have found traces of things called the Biblian hieroglyphs. So given the fact that they did not retain use of the alphabet, that indicates that originally Hebrew post-Babel was not their language. They had received a mixed language. But what's interesting is that right around the time of 1000 BC, we start seeing Phoenician being written using the alphabet. 1000 BC, right around the time of David. And David was very close with one of the kings there in Phoenicia, the king of Tyre, Hiram. Kind of an interesting thing there. And so you can see that there's been a change in the Canaanite language to where now the Canaanite dialect is very close to Hebrew, as well as the fact that it's being represented using the alphabet. And then guess what? The Phoenicians end up taking the alphabet to the land of Yawan, to Greece, right about 700 BC. And that is when Greek comes into contact with Phoenician, and they begin to use the alphabet. And then, oh, look at this. Egyptian. What writing system did Egypt use? Hieroglyphs. But what system do they use now? They use the alphabet. And that is because during the time that Greek was the lingua franca, Greek came into contact with Egyptian, and that's when the Egyptians began to use the alphabet, and you can see that that's where we have the Coptic alphabet begin to develop. And so you can see all of the alphabets of the world can be traced ultimately all the way back to Hebrew, including the alphabets of India, because the alphabets of India trace all the way back to the Aramaic alphabet. The Aramaic alphabet traces all the way back to Hebrew. All right. So
questions?
Yes. Any questions?
Well,
Yes.
I noticed that you have, I noticed on the chart there that the Canaanite language is an offshoot of the Semitic.
Yes. That's tentative. We know that Canaan was a descendant of Kang. All right. So, but it's interesting if you take a look at the Canaanite dialects that we have translated, that we have access to and we can actually read, those are all written using a Semitic dialect. So that once again tells me that there's been contact between the Canaanites and the Eberites, between the Canaanites and the Shemites. But I also know that that Hebrew dialect was probably not originally with the Canaanites because of the presence of those Biblian hieroglyphs. Now, we've not been able to translate the Biblian hieroglyphs as of yet because of the fact that there's no bilingual text that has been found yet, but it is thought, based on the rough guesses of linguists, that that particular language is probably very closely related to Egyptian. So this Canaanite being an offshoot of Semitic, that was before I had found out about the Biblian hieroglyphs. So that was just based on the information that I had found where the linguists are categorizing the Canaanite dialects as Semitic. But that does not occur until 1000 BC, when there was very close contact between Phoenicia and Israel. So, any?
Kind of in a sense, you could kind of say it maybe started with the Canaanite and then as it contacted with Semitic, it kind of morphed into what we consider Canaanite.
Exactly. Yes.
So, what about this thing? Every time I look in seems like in the books and things, they all trace the languages back to Aramaic, and they even call the letters Aramaic letters.
They do. And the reason that they will go ahead and do that is because they are taking a look at the historical evidence and are saying, oh, well, you know what, we have evidence of Aramaic writing prior to Hebrew writing, so therefore Aramaic must come first. Well, you think about it. The Arameans were already settled fairly well in the land of Aram, but the descendants of Abraham, they were nomadic. So inscriptions that last usually are those inscriptions that are written in stone. Stone lasts, whereas papyrus, plant fibers, do not last through millennia. So naturally, we're going to be able to find the inscriptions that were written on stone more than we would find early inscriptions on papyrus and plant fibers and things of that nature. The Hebrews, because of the fact that they were nomads, moving around a lot, they're not going to be carrying around heavy materials like stone. They're going to be carrying around lightweight documents, which means that those are going to be written on perishable materials, which means those materials are not going to last down to the present time, generally speaking, for us to be able to examine them and say, oh, yes, look at that, the Hebrews did in fact write prior to the Arameans. It's also an interesting thing, if you actually take a look at the Aramaic language, and you will notice that there are certain differences between Aramaic and Hebrew. For instance, where Hebrew will have a vowel that is what we call rounded, that is where the lips are rounded, so kind of like the oo or o sound, and you can see the difference. Ah, o, you can see that my lips are rounded when I say o, right? Well, where Hebrew has that o sound, Aramaic will have an ah sound. So rounded, unrounded. Language does not change in that way. You don't go from a plus category to a minus, from a minus category to a plus category. Instead, you go from a plus to a minus. So we would expect that the language would go from rounded to unrounded as opposed to unrounded to rounded. But the linguists have not taken a look at that and have not gone ahead and altered their argument, because if they do that, then they have to acknowledge that Hebrew was original, which means that then they have to acknowledge the truth of the scriptures. So that's kind of one of those interesting things.
I
Yes.
actually found some interesting evidence in the scriptures themselves that the language that was spoken in the Old Testament was indeed Hebrew as opposed to
Yes, because of the fact that we can take a look and see that, let's see. The name of the first man was what? So Adam. It's interesting that the name Adam has meaning in Hebrew, means man, mankind. Let's see, what was the name of his son, the one who replaced Abel? Sheth. So Sheth, and Sheth means to set, to place in Hebrew. And the same thing, and even just the one that we were talking about earlier, Methuselah, in the dying of him it will be sent, meaning in Hebrew. Now, interesting thing is, all of those pre-flood patriarchs, each one of those names has meaning in Hebrew. We know that the Hebrews, when they were writing the documents there that we have in Scripture, they did not translate foreign names. They transliterated them. For instance, let's see, the king of Egypt, what was the title that he went by? Pharaoh. And it's interesting, Pharaoh means big house in Egyptian, but has no meaning in Hebrew. So once again, the Hebrews had a choice. They could have gone ahead and taken that name Pharaoh and have translated it into Hebrew so that it would make sense in their language. They didn't do that. They simply took the Egyptian name, the Egyptian title, and transliterated it into the Hebrew alphabet. That's what they did. So we know if that was their practice, then they would not have translated the names of the pre-flood patriarchs into Hebrew. They would have simply transliterated them. But it's interesting that all of those names have meaning in Hebrew, which points to the fact that the language that God built into Adam was Hebrew. All right, and then it's also an interesting thing. We can also take a look at the opening chapters there in Genesis, and we can see that those opening chapters written by Adam were written using an alphabet rather than a pictographic or syllabic. Reason being, just the opening verses there in Genesis chapter 1, the whole meaning of that particular passage relies heavily on the distinction between two conjunctions in Hebrew, the while consecutive and the while conjunctive. What's interesting is that in pictographic and syllabic writing systems, you can't distinguish between those two because one, in pictographic languages, they don't represent conjunctions. Two, syllabic writing systems, well, one of those conjunctions is pointed with what we call a simple vocal schwa, a half vowel. Syllabic writing systems don't represent half vowels. So the only writing system that you could use to represent those conjunctions would be the alphabetic writing system. So once again, pointing to the idea that, of course, not only was Hebrew the language that God had built into Adam, but also God had also built into Adam the knowledge of an alphabetic writing system, which Adam then proceeded to use. Okay?
What about the the relationship between Jacob and Laban and what they named the pillar that they raised up?
That's kind of an interesting thing here. May I go over to the Bible Works?
You may.
So.
Just don't mess up my computer.
All right. So That's here. So. Here we go. So Genesis 31:48, and Laban said, "This heap is a witness between me and thee this day." Therefore was the name of it called Galeed. And Mizpah. Let's see what happened here. Here we go. Going back up. So, and Laban called the heap Jegar-sahadutha, but Jacob called it Galeed. What's interesting is that both of these names have meaning. They mean exactly the same thing. They both mean heap of witness. But what Laban calls it, that is Aramaic. Galeed is Hebrew. So both of them are calling the heap the same thing, heap of witness, but they're calling it that same name in different languages. So this indicates that Jacob spoke Hebrew. Now, where would it have been that Jacob would have acquired the Hebrew language? From his father, Isaac. Where would Isaac have acquired it? From his father, Abraham. Where would Abraham have acquired it? From his father. And it's all the way back to Adam, if you trace it all the way back.
And Abraham was called?
He was called the Hebrew. And what's interesting is that you will read in some commentators where they will say that, oh, well, you know, the name Hebrew there comes from the word ever, which means just to pass over. So that is pointing to the fact that Abraham was a foreigner there in the land of Canaan. Not so, because of the fact that, let's see here. So, and there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abraham. You can see that right here, Abram the Hebrew, Mamre the Amorite. Both of those words, Hebrew and Amorite, have the same ending in the Hebrew, indicating that they're both referring to the same thing. That is, that they're both referring to a people group. And Amorite, Amori, has the idea of a descendant of Amor. So Hebrew then, if it is right there in conjunction with that use of that very same suffix, indicates that Hebrew is referring to a descendant of Eber. So, once again, and why would Abram have been called a Hebrew? Because he would be associated with Eber as a descendant of him. Well, how would the individuals around him have known that he was a descendant of Eber? By virtue of the language that he used. So, that's one of those things. And then it's also interesting that Joseph, do you remember what it was that when Potiphar's wife accused Joseph to Potiphar? She called him that Hebrew slave. So they knew that Joseph was a Hebrew. And Joseph, what language would Joseph have used? He would have used the language of his father, Jacob, who we just saw used the Hebrew language. So all of these things taken together, one point by itself does not prove, but when you take all of these points that are speaking in concert with one another, it clearly indicates that Hebrew was in fact the original language. And this is why we can see similarities between Hebrew and the other languages, because Hebrew was the language that God mixed. So we would then expect to see very similar things among the languages. Let's see. What is our word for this planet that we live on? Earth. Yes. So let's see. Earth. Does anyone know the Spanish word for earth?
Tierra.
Yes, tierra. And let's see, kind of an interesting thing, the Hebrew word for earth is eretz. You can hear the similarity. Eretz, earth, where tierra is just where the consonants have changed places. The consonants have mixed, if
Which
you
is
will.
not uncommon.
Not at all uncommon.
So you're essentially saying that the Spanish version for earth and the Hebrew version of earth are, this is my oversimplification trying to understand, are essentially reversed in terms of consonants
Yes,
from each other. They're
exactly.
polar opposites.
Same.
Yes, basically it's taking the same consonants,
Wow.
but just mixing the order. So
So
that
he took all the Hebrew and just like put it in a bottle thing and shook it up. And I mean,
in a
that's
way,
an
yes,
oversimplification too.
but just basically taking all of those elements and then changing the relationships, like with eretz and tierra. So you have eretz, where you can see that you have the vowel first, then the R, then the T sound, and then tierra, the T sound, the R sound, then the vowel sound. And that is all over the place. Let's see, there's another word that is very similar, that is similar in meaning to earth, that the Hebrews also had. Adama literally means ground. And then what is the Russian word for earth?
Oh, I don't remember.
Zemlyu or
Zemlyu.
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 So Zemlyu, it's kind of an interesting thing. You can hear that Zemlyu has an M in it, right? It's not at all uncommon for a D to be changed to a Z sound. All right, because you can hear the very similarity between them. D, Z, D, Z. So Adama, if you drop the initial vowel, you get Dama. Well, if you change that to a Z sound, Zemlyu, you can hear the similarity there as well. So that is, once again, that Russian word for earth, Zemlyu, related to the Hebrew word Adama, which is very closely related to, yes.
I don't think I have it where
I
we could call it up, but you could just show them that.
Yeah.
by hand.
So here is another thing. This is a document, the alphabet comparison chart. And what it does is it takes the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. This is the alphabet that the Hebrews used before the Babylonian captivity. And it shows the similarity between that alphabet and the Greek alphabet. And you will see that those alphabets are basically essentially the same. Some of the forms may have changed slightly in their orientation, but basically it's the same shapes, same values. Then if you take that Greek alphabet, you can see the similarity between that and the Latin alphabet, because that's where it went. It went from Hebrew to the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians brought it over to the Greeks, and then the Greeks gave it to the Etruscans gave it to the Romans. And then from the Romans, it spread all over Western Europe to where we now use the Latin alphabet. Then, what's also interesting is that there were two individuals, Cyril and Methodius, who went ahead and took the Greek alphabet and used it to reduce the Slavic languages to writing. And that's where we get our Cyrillic alphabet. And if you take a look at this chart, you will see that the Greek and the Russian alphabets are very, very similar in form and values. And then you can go ahead and follow that as well. If we take a look at the alphabet that the Hebrews used after the Babylonian captivity, we call that the Aramaic script. Well, that Aramaic script became widely used, especially during the empires there, the Persian and the Babylonian empires. And during that time, that's when the Nabateans, that is the northern Arabs, adopted the alphabet, and that's where we get the Nabatean alphabet, which eventually became the Arabic alphabet. And that Arabic alphabet has been used for, let's see, Farsi is written in it, as well as Mongolian and several other languages as well. The Aramaic alphabet also led to the creation of several of the Indian alphabets. And what's interesting is that the Indian alphabets, one of those Indian alphabets somehow found its way all the way into the Philippines. And there was an alphabet that the people of the Philippines used prior to the coming of the Spaniards that is related to the Indian scripts. And then with the coming of the Spaniards, they then adopted the Latin alphabet. And then, you know, that Cyrillic alphabet that we were talking about and the Greek alphabet? Well, the Greek alphabet then was adopted by the Christians there in Egypt, the Coptics, and they used that alphabet to reduce their language to writing so that they wouldn't have to use the pagan hieroglyphic script to represent their language, because they didn't want to use something that was used for the pagan religion in order to talk about in their language the things of the one true and living God. And so you can see then all of the languages trace their way all the way back to the Hebrew. So,
Okay.
yes, sir.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.